A monk asked Baso in all earnestness, "What is Buddha?" Baso replied, "No mind, no Buddha." Hello and welcome to the Kōan Series. In the Kōan Series, we will read and discuss famous koans used by real Buddhist monks from such sources as the Blue Cliff Record, the Gateless Gate, the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and many others. Full disclosure, this is not how koans are used or ought to be used in Buddhist practice, but I'm here to give some extra context and meanings to some of these koans so that you might see them in a new light and gain some new or deeper meaning from them than you did before. I hope you enjoy. Today's koan is known in English as No Mind, No Buddha, and it comes to us from the Kōan Yamada translation of the Gateless Gate, which is known as the Wu Men Guan in Chinese or the Mumonkan in Japanese. If you remember from before, this is a collection of 48 Chan or Zen koans compiled in the early 13th century by a Chinese Zen master known as Wu Men Huikai. This is one of the most important compilations of koans in all Chan or Zen Buddhism, the other being the Blue Cliff Record, which was compiled in 1125 in China. This koan is case 33 and is a companion to case 30, which we did in our last episode. Case 30 is known as Mind is Buddha, and it contains the same character as this one, known as Baso. If you remember, Baso is the Japanese name for the Dharma grandson of the 6th patriarch of Chan Buddhism in China, known as Huineng. The question facing us in this episode is this: why did he say Mind is Buddha in case 30 and say No Mind, No Buddha in this one? How are these koans not contradictory? This is what we will be discussing today. I would like to offer that these two statements, Mind is Buddha and No Mind, No Buddha, can be understood perhaps as two sides of the same coin. In order to understand what is going on here, we will be discussing skillful means, the doctrine of two truths, and emptiness. To begin with, let's talk about skillful means. For more on this, I would like to refer you to episode 39, What is Upaya? In this episode, I mentioned that skillful means is an English translation of a Sanskrit term known as upaya. It can also be translated as expedient means, and it is a very important concept in Mahayana Buddhism. Essentially, the idea is that an individual becomes enlightened, and consequently, since enlightenment is omniscience, they have the ability to know the capacity for wisdom and understanding among all sentient beings. Similarly, they also know how to use language and action in an enlightened way. They have the knowledge and command of causes and conditions, which allows them to do or say exactly what is necessary, when it is necessary, to whom it is necessary, in order to cause beings to attain enlightenment. To do so is to make use of skillful means. The fundamental assumption is that one cannot communicate enlightenment using only direct words and speaking. How do you describe the taste of chocolate to somebody who has never tasted chocolate? You simply can't. So in that example, we can say in a broad sense that upaya is using delightful and encouraging speech and actions to lead the person to go and taste chocolate themselves. To carry the metaphor further, making use of skillful means would include listing out the ingredients of chocolate using your words, but also demonstrating through your actions the power, the joy, the wisdom, or whatever else that comes from having tasted chocolate. Buddhas and bodhisattvas know what chocolate tastes like. They know each sentient being's capacity for tasting chocolate. They know exactly what needs to happen to awaken in each and every sentient being the desire to taste chocolate. This has been the doctrinal explanation of upaya, and now let's include the textual explanation. Upaya is a post-canonical term, meaning that it is rarely, if ever, used in the Pali Canon in the way that I have explained it here. Similarly, at the same time, the texts of the Pali Canon have a remarkably different textual form than do the texts from the Mahayana canons. The Pali Canon texts are like technical manuals. They're descriptions of matrices and formulas of analysis and ritual, which are written out in words. This is partly due to the fact that this was easier to preserve for an oral tradition based on memorization and recitation. The Mahayana texts, on the other hand, are literature. They have narrative plots, characters, scenes, and other artistic components. This difference is explained in the Mahayana by the different capacities of the audience. In the Pali Canon, nobody in the Buddha's audience was yet enlightened enough to understand the subtleties of the doctrines of emptiness or interdependent origination, so the Buddha had to start with simple things like the Four Noble Truths. Then, in the later Mahayana teachings, The Buddha was able to use parables, metaphors, similes, special psychic powers, and other such creative tools to teach and encourage people because they already understood the basics and could access the subtler teachings that were contained within those stories. This is one of the ways that the Mahayana looks down condescendingly upon the Theravada, but we talk about that a lot in other episodes, so I won't get into it again here. The important thing to remember is that just because he taught differently to the Arhats and to the Bodhisattvas does not mean that the things that he said to one group were false and that the things he said to the other group were true, or vice versa. Actually, all of what he said was capital T true in the sense that it was all capital D Dharma, given by the Buddha. We can demonstrate that all of these are coherent and cohesive teachings by using a metaphor of mathematics. In mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4 on the one hand, and on the other hand, the real solutions of the quadratic equation x = -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a are both true, real, correct math, in the sense that 2 + 2 = 5 is not. It is just that one is suited to the capacities of one particular group, and the other is suited to the capacities of another group. The way that this is relevant to the koan above is that the answers that Baso gave to one person in case 30 is different from the answer he gave in case 33. We must infer that Baso, making use of skillful means, understood that their capacities were different, and thus adjusted his answers accordingly. However, as we'll find out throughout the course of this discussion, neither statement that he gave to either person was false. In the episode on Case 30, Mind is Buddha, we thoroughly discussed how it could be the case that mind is Buddha. I will not go back over that again. However, I'll mention that Teisho, who offers his commentary on the cases and on Wu Men Huikai or Mu Mon's commentary, describes these complementary koans like this. Begin quote. Today, as in the past, most people search for the truth outside of mind. This is a weakness and a sickness in ordinary people. We should know that as long as we look for truth or reality in the objective world, we will never attain true peace of mind. In order to remedy this malady, Baso gave the following instruction: the very mind is Buddha. The most fundamental delusion ordinary people have is that they think the objective world which they can grasp with their senses is the only one that exists. They do not think that there is any other world. This is not true. In order to break this delusion and help people open their real eye, Baso taught, the very mind is Buddha. With these words, many people attained Satori, but many people were apt to form ideas about the mind or the Buddha. Some people, for example, may think that the mind has a form of some kind, being heart-shaped or round, and so forth. Others may think that it is something that separates from the body at death and flies away by itself like a cicada. Other people may take the superficial consciousness, the six senses, for the real mind. It was to help people get rid of these concepts that Baso preached, no mind, no Buddha. We should know that both mind and Buddha are concepts. However deeply we may search for our mind, we will never find it to have form, color, weight, or a place of abode. In a word, it is empty. When we feel joyful, it is very clear to us that the joy arises out of our mind, but of itself joy has no substance. We cannot show others what it looks like, for it too is empty. In the same way, all the activities of the mind are, in the end, totally void. End quote. This says it better than I ever could. The reason that he says mind is Buddha to some is to impress upon them the singularity and the oneness between mind, suchness, and Buddha nature. All three are ultimate reality exactly as it is. The reason he says no mind, no Buddha is to impress upon them that ultimate reality, all-encompassing as it is also completely empty of self-nature. Together, we can take these two proclamations to be reflective of the doctrine of two truths, which we'll discuss now. The doctrine of two truths is very important in Mahayana Buddhism. The doctrine itself is a means of distinguishing between two levels of understanding reality or truth, and together they represent two sides of the exact same coin. The first truth, or the first level of understanding reality, is known in Sanskrit as samvriti satya, and it refers to the daily life experiences we have. Under this category, the proclamation that mind is Buddha can fall. The second truth is referred to in Sanskrit as paramartha satya, and it refers to the ultimate truth of the emptiness of all things. Under this category, the proclamation no mind, no Buddha can fall. It may seem from the words that are used in the translation that provisional truth or provisional reality is somehow inferior or otherwise diluted and impure compared to ultimate truth or ultimate reality, but that is not always actually the case. Both of these truths can each be viewed from an enlightened perspective and an unenlightened perspective. The unenlightened perspective of provisional reality is that everything we see that happens before us in our daily life experience is totally real and is not empty, not impermanent, not marked by suffering and desire, and so on. It is the view that provisional reality does not mirror or reflect ultimate reality. It is the view that there is a disconnect between our daily life experiences and the Buddha Dharma. The enlightened view is that this reality before our very eyes is marked by Buddha nature, by emptiness, impermanence, and suffering, and by the characteristic of being consciousness only. We have talked about Buddha nature and the 3 marks of reality quite a bit on this show, so I won't go back into those right now, but I will explain a little bit about this consciousness only. There is a doctrine out there that existence as it is a function of the consciousness. This is not my consciousness or your consciousness, because we have no individual and permanent selves. However, this is also not some sort of universal collective consciousness. This is more like the principle or the property of consciousness itself. What I mean by that is that in Buddhism, the nature of something is determined by how it is cognized or how it is experienced. How we cognize stuff is determined then by our karma, and in turn determines our karma. This is not solipsism. The Buddhists are not saying that nothing outside of one's own mind exists. They are saying that the mode of existence of all things, be it good, bad, or neutral, is determined by our cognition experience, which is determined by our karma. Thus, all things are provisional. They are dependent on our cognition. In this sense, and in the sense that all things are impermanent and empty, all the reality of our daily life experience is provisional. However, just because it is provisional does not mean we cannot come to know ultimate reality through it. In fact, it is because of the characteristics I have mentioned that it's possible to know ultimate reality through provisional reality. Moving on to ultimate truth or ultimate reality, there are also 2 perspectives of this truth. The unenlightened perspective of ultimate reality is that it is anything other than emptiness. When we say consciousness only, we may think that consciousness or mind actually exists, or that the reality that it determines actually exists, but this is not the case. This can lead us to several erroneous views. Thinking that either of those things exists could lead us to believe, perhaps, that every aspect of reality that we experience is separate and distinct. We could think that the reality that we experience is separate from ultimate reality, etc. But all of these are incorrect views. Thus, the enlightened view of ultimate reality is to view all aspects of reality, all events, all things, all beings within it, all to be interpenetrating, mutually dependent on each other, all in the process of non-arising, and all empty of any inherent, concrete, unchanging, everlasting, indestructible nature. This includes everything from all of the 6 sense objects to the Buddha himself. Given that all things are interpenetrating, mutually dependent on one another, all in the process of non-arising, and all empty, that is why enlightenment is omniscience. It is intimate knowledge of all of the networks of cause and condition that cause the non-arising of all things in reality, and at the same time, it is knowledge of their nature, which is emptiness. Thus, provisional reality or provisional truth, where all these aspects of reality occur before us, is a necessary part of ultimate reality and ultimate truth. They interpenetrate each other, and thus one is not superior to the other, nor is one hiding behind the other, nor do they even describe different phenomena. Related to the koan, to say that mind is Buddha would lead us to think that the mind exists, and that existence is non-dual with Buddha nature, the nature of awakening, the nature of cessation, and so on. We would in this case be approaching an enlightened view of provisional reality even if we hadn't fully gotten there yet. However, all of this is undermined by the case that we have today and the proclamation that it makes. No mind, no Buddha. Mind is empty. Cognition and consciousness are empty. All aspects of reality that cognition determines are empty. Thus, even the Buddha himself is empty. Now we arrive at a truly enlightened view of absolute reality. Here, I would like to introduce Mumon's commentary on this case. He writes, quote, "If you can see into what is said here, your study is at an end." End quote. If you can see into no mind, no Buddha, then your study is at an end. If you get this one, you're finished on your quest of enlightenment or of Buddhahood. This is confusing for a couple of reasons, but before we get to those, I just want to mention that this is referring to the fact that if you truly and completely understand the ultimate reality of emptiness, then that is enlightenment, as I mentioned before. However, this quote is confusing because it seems to argue that if you're enlightened, your study is at an end. Now, why is this confusing? There are certainly some schools of Buddhism that think that. that think that once you have achieved enlightenment or achieved Buddhahood, then it's all over. You have climbed the mountain, fallen off of the top, and now you're done. You're there. However, Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism don't actually really think that. While this makes one think that once you have insight into this koan, you're totally done and you can get your Buddha degree and go, it actually means that your study has ended, but your practice now begins. You'll remember that I've discussed at length in the Zen episode, all things are originally enlightened, and thus, to study and to meditate is to re-realize that original enlightenment. Once that enlightenment is re-realized, then you don't stop and go about your day cheering about how you've done it and you're done. No, instead, you start doing what enlightened people and Buddhas do. There's another phrase, which is a little like a koan, which demonstrates the point I'm making. It reads, quote, Zen Master Baocha of Mount Mayu was fanning himself. A monk approached and said, Master, the nature of wind is unchanging, and there is no place it does not reach. Why then do you fan yourself? Although you understand that the nature of wind is permanent, Baocha replied, you do not understand the meaning of its reaching everywhere. What is the meaning of its reaching everywhere? Asked the monk again. The master just kept fanning himself. The monk bowed deeply. End quote. Here, the wind is Buddha nature, enlightenment, Buddhahood, awakening, etc., and fanning yourself is practice and study. The result of both is air blowing on you. Thus, just because you are enlightened does not mean you stop practicing and studying. The reason that enlightened individuals continue to meditate and study is because that is what enlightened people do. This creates an ideal of the enlightened person who never thinks of the path like a path with an end. Knowing that the path has no end and no beginning is central to understanding this original enlightenment doctrine. It has no beginning because we didn't become enlightened in some distant past. We are originally that way. In this way, it has no end because it's not like we study and then we get it and then we're done. We have it, but we can lose it due to our karma and our delusion and things that hinder us. Therefore, we work constantly to keep it. Complacency is not a good way to hang on to anything. That the path has no end and no beginning is a matter of non-duality. There is no such duality as beginning and end, start and finish, etc. There is only reality exactly as it is, which is originally enlightened. We should now talk a little bit more about emptiness. We have an entire episode on this, but I think it would be useful to go back over it again. If you remember, emptiness begins with impermanence. All things change over time. This is verifiable fact. If all things change over time, then that means that there can be no such thing as an everlasting, unchanging, and indestructible soul in sentient beings. If that applies to sentient beings, it must also apply to all other constituents of reality. No thing out there has any sort of unchanging, indestructible, everlasting existence. This is true of the Buddha himself as much as it's true of anybody else. This is true of mind as much as it's true of anything else. If there is no everlasting or unchanging existence in anything, it is easy to think that nothing exists at all. Similarly, if we believe that there is no permanence of any kind, that might lead us to think that the world is complete, unpredictable chaos. However, we know from our daily life experience that this is not necessarily the case. We still see everything before our eyes, and those things are mostly predictable. That's because everything exists provisionally, in a cause and effect relationship, and in a relatively continuous fashion. Emptiness and impermanence don't discount relative continuity or daily life experience as we experience it. They simply describe it. They argue that things don't arise in time and cease in time. Instead, they undergo non-arising. Arising means existing for a time and then no longer existing. This is something that can't happen according to the doctrine of impermanence and emptiness. Non-arising is coming about in a cause and effect relationship with all other things in reality. It means arising dependent on causes and conditions, which themselves are dependent on other causes and conditions. Nothing comes into existence, and similarly, nothing ceases to exist. There is no existence in the sense of the word that implies an everlasting, unchanging something. Thus, the doctrine of emptiness applies equally to the Buddha and to the mind. The Buddha does not have any sort of permanent, indestructible, everlasting existence. Similarly, the mind is not the soul, which we would think of as having everlasting, indestructible existence, because there is no such thing as a soul in Buddhism. The mind doesn't exist permanently, and it's also fleeting as well. We've talked about the five aggregates doctrine before, wherein our existence, as we conventionally understand it, is not indicative of an everlasting unchanging self or soul, but rather indicative of five aggregations based on our karmic momentum from the past. As long as we continue to act karmically, be it karmically good, bad, or neutral, that will trap us in a cycle of cause and effect, or the cycle of birth and rebirth. Thus, when we die and are reincarnated, there is no rebirth of the body around a soul which is unchanged from the previous life. That's an incorrect understanding of reincarnation. In fact, reincarnation is a reshuffling of all of our physical form, our sensations, our perceptions, our mental formations, and our consciousness into a new form according to our karma. If we have overall bad karma, all of these things reorganize into something worse, be it an animal, hungry ghost, or a hell dweller. If our karma is overall good, we get reorganized into something better, like a god, an arhat, a bodhisattva, or a Buddha. As you can see, emptiness is a key doctrine that touches many other foundational doctrines in Buddhism, such as karma, reincarnation, dependent origination, impermanence, and so on. Emptiness is prioritized as a critically important doctrine in the Mahayana due to the sheer scope of its meaning. This is expounded heavily upon in the works of Nagarjuna, a famous Buddhist thinker who wrote extensively on emptiness. If one comes to fully understand the nature of emptiness, then, according to some schools of Mahayana Buddhism, they will come to understand the true nature of all reality itself and become enlightened. Emptiness is often strongly aligned with suchness. As we've talked about before, suchness refers to the nature of reality free from conceptual elaborations or the subject-object distinction. In this case, true emptiness is one of the ways we can understand this inner nature of reality, and that inner nature of reality is something that is itself ineffable. So in Mumon's commentary on this koan, when he says that when you understand what this koan is pointing to, which is the true non-arising of all dharmas, your study is finished, he means that when you understand emptiness, the provisionality or the non-arising of all things, including the Buddha and the mind, then your study is done. To put it all together, even though this koan seems contradictory to the one where Baso says that mind is Buddha, it actually fits together with it quite nicely. They refer to different aspects of the same teaching. They refer to the different ways for apprehending the true nature of reality and what it means to understand it. These two statements are given in their two different forms because there are different types of people who are bogged down by different types of misunderstandings, and they each all need to hear something different to overcome those misunderstandings. To use religious studies scholarship jargon, this is the difference between cataphatic and apophatic exegesis. These two terms are used mainly in Christianity, and in their older usages, they each refer to different ways of understanding and knowing God. Cataphatic exegesis is the understanding that God is ever present in reality as it is and can be known to us in our conventional day-to-day lives. Apophatic exegesis refers to the understanding that God is absent from our reality and is transcendent, above it, and thus our ever-present reality must be overcome or negated in order to know him. It should be clear to you that these terms don't really fit over the study of Buddhism in these older forms, but they can be adapted and have been adapted to make more sense here. Their use in the context of this koan would look like the following. The statement that mind is Buddha is cataphatic, as it refers to the ever-present nature of Buddha nature, awakening, suchness, and ultimate reality in our day-to-day experience. It refers to the fact that we should not understand our minds or ourselves as being anything other than Buddha nature, awakening, suchness, and ultimate reality. This ultimate reality is knowable to us and ever-present to us. On the other hand, the statement, no mind, no Buddha, is apophatic. Reality presents itself to us as existing. The microphone that I'm speaking into right now is indeed in front of my face, and I won't live long enough to see it disintegrate into something else, which could indicate to me that its existence is a foregone conclusion. However, that's not the case either. It is actually empty of this substantial existence, and the only way for me to come to know that ultimate reality is through emptying it out and everything else, and negating any semblance of an unchanging thing. While in their older forms these terms were competing ways for understanding the relationship between our daily lives and God, now, in the case of Buddhism, we can understand them as a dualistic pair. Although they may be opposites, they're connected in that they each point us to a singular truth. As such, if the dualism they create can be transcended, then that would advance us on the path of enlightenment. To sum it all up, to think that mind is anything other than Buddha nature would be false and incorrect. However, at the same time, to think that there is such a thing as a self which can possess a mind, which is of this Buddha nature, is also false and incorrect. Thus, Baso made these two statements to his two different disciples, and each of them benefited from it greatly. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Kōan Series, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this is Med Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.